Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Elixir Mix podcast. This week on our panel, we have Eric Berry.
Hey.
Josh Adams.
Hello.
Mark Erikson.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Claudio Ortolina.
Hello, everyone.
Now, I made the joke on Ruby Rogues, and for different reasons, I know how to say your name, too. It's been nice.
It is very pleasant to hear it pronounced correctly.
Awesome. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick? Let people know who you are, what you do?
Yeah, I'm Claudio. I work for Erlang Solutions based in London, United Kingdom. I'm a developer, essentially, a consultant. I spend most of my time working with different customers, usually with one that goes on for a while, like long projects, and then like spot assignments here and there. I work 100% with Elixir. I've been doing that for, I think, almost 3 years, 2 years in this specific job. And I got the opportunity to speak to quite a good number of people on concrete production projects that they have. So it gives me the opportunity to see how they use the language, what are the hurdles, the problems they have, going from, architecture down to how do I test this thing, which is incredibly tricky because you have to synchronize 3 different pieces and I don't know how to do it, and then we can figure it out together. So it's challenging at times, but at the end of the day, it's quite rewarding.
That sounds awesome. And you mentioned Erlang Solutions. We had Francesco Cesarini on Ruby Rogues, episode 208. So if people are interested in that, the episode's a few years old, but still great information there. And if you want to find out more about Erlang and Erlang Solutions, check it out.
Yeah, he's not technically my boss, but in practice, he's my boss. Like it's so he's the founder of the company, is incredibly passionate about anything related to distributed systems and Erlang. And I recommend this, whatever books he wrote, they're really good read.
Awesome. Now, we brought you on to talk about some of the process things and things that people run into doing Elixir. And I'm kind of curious, just to get us started, is there one thing that kind of stands out to you as the easiest or most common thing that you can fix in your process or in the way you set up Elixir projects? I think in general, people really pick up the language very quickly. That is true across the board with, even if I think about different languages than people know before approaching Elixir, the learning curve is really fast in the beginning. What I always notice is people get to the point where they go beyond maybe like the simple sequential program or a program that has a clear HTTP interface, like maybe a web application where you do everything in your controller or during your request cycle. And then when they venture in sort of like asynchronous programming or evented or concurrent, that's when they sort of like stop and they're going to be puzzled. So they start to look into concurrent programming, and it starts to get a bit difficult at that point. And that is a very, very common thing. I'm just trying to think about projects where there wasn't a point that required more work and more thinking, but I think it's across the board is the thing that gets people a little bit scratching their head in the beginning, and over time they can get over that. Obviously, like everyone, like you put enough effort into it and you just get over it. But you see a lot of things that get repeated project to project, and things that could be much better or easier or simpler, and you sort of like see and then make the same changes and then try to distill them into a series of steps they can replicate across projects. But it's difficult to move that knowledge from company to company. But I guess it makes my job a little bit easier because I can sort of like look at things and just say, okay, that's the same problem, and we can look at it this way and try to solve it. I don't know if it makes sense, the whole thing. I guess it's just a repetition.
When I came to Elixir, one of the things that really excited about me was OTP. And, the idea of supervisors and these interprocesses and communication and sending messages, and that really got me excited. I loved pattern matching. I loved all of the features of just the language itself, but it was really OTP that was the most exciting for me because that was the newest kind of like power that I saw in this language, in the Beam. And I think that's kind of what you're saying there, right? Like, it's when people, they say, they come to the language and they figure out, okay, pattern matching, that is so cool. That, look at all this awesome code I can throw away that I used to write, and it can just write it better. But it is really when they get to concurrency. And so one of the things that I've seen people do, and I'm curious if you've seen this as well, is where people like, I've seen a lot of people where they come from Ruby as a background. And when they come to Elixir and they start getting into the area of OTP, rather than learn OTP, like how to do it themselves, they just say, well, I'll just use this library, or I'll still use Redis, and I'll still use these other things that are kind of implementing OTP concepts for me. Is that something you see a lot, and how do you address that for people?
So I guess I should have said OTP as the first thing. Like, I sort of like went around it, but that is definitely what I was referring to. I think you have a point. It is true that if you sort of like drop down to the building blocks of process and message passing and then OTP, you would get all of that knowledge, and then you can build upon and build something that could fit your use case. Like you build your own abstraction on top of a gen server, or you look at your supervision tree and everything. There's an element of, like, for example, Elixir provide already some abstractions on top of this. Like, it provides like tasks and agents. And they have a really nice API, right? They're simple when you look at them, because you look very few functions. The documentation is great, and you look at them and you start using them, and things on the surface work very nicely. The part where it gets a little bit trickier is when you start to push some traffic onto these applications, and then suddenly there's a lot of surprises around. Okay, why is this slowing down, or where is the problem in this area? And sometimes it boils down to one agent that is collecting messages without being able to process them fast enough. And it's not problems that you have at day one, right? A lot of companies don't have enough traffic to really put the VM or the runtime under real stress. It will handle like a few hundred requests per second. I mean, it depends on what you do, but most of the times it's okay. You throw a little bit more hardware and it's gonna be okay. But when it comes to maybe like 6 months in, a year in, or a little bit more, which is where a lot of the companies are now, we are seeing projects of a certain size now. It's it's increasingly rare to find little greenfield projects. Most of the customers we work with, whether it's, I don't know if it's because of the reputation of the company or like it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, but I get to see projects that have a certain volume of code or a volume of traffic, and it gets to the point where these little things down the line become problems, because in the end, those building blocks, if you break them apart and you look at the OTP building blocks, then you can see, okay, this is a gen server, so if I do a call, it's going to queue at that point, it's going to wait, and then I'm going to see what that means, and I'm going to possibly measure that and then move on. But when you start with the abstractions, as you mentioned, whether it's third parties or built in the Elixir standard library, some of this knowledge gets somewhat hidden, and you come across it later, which is a double-edged sword. It's nice because not people don't need to know everything from the start to be productive, and that's really, really good. But at the same time, it postpones a moment where that type of knowledge is required, and that's when like the community can jump in, and literature and books and everything that we can do as a community to make that transition easier, where when you require that knowledge, it's much more accessible. And in that way, compared to a couple of years ago, it's much, much better now. There's way more material. There's way more open source code that people can look at. So reading the source is incredibly vital at this stage, even more than, I would say in many cases, even more than reading more articles or more books about the matter, because you don't come across a lot of the edge cases that you see in actual code. And there's plenty of libraries that end up stretching these boundaries. So it's definitely a much better state of things.
Now, you talked about how the way things are set up, it kind of postpones the point where people have to start diving into this, do you recommend then that beginners dive into OTP and things like that? Or is it appropriate to have that postponed for you?
I think it's okay to postpone it, to be honest. There's an element of like the first time you write your something on top of a Gen server, or the first time you build a supervision tree that works, it's a nice feeling. There might be a temptation to say, to use that as some sort of a rite of passage in using the language, or something that people have to do. I don't necessarily believe that, in the sense that a lot of companies, they spend like maybe 3-6 months building a product that it works, it's performant, it does the job, and everyone's happy. And they don't have to write explicitly a single line of code that touches OTP constructs. They just use whatever is provided by the framework they're using, whether it's through Phoenix or through other specific libraries. It doesn't really matter, but they might not need it at all. And I think it's important to keep that, because it gives people the ability to build something that they're happy about. And the feedback cycle keeps them satisfied, and gives them like energy to move forward. I think what's the missing link at this point is that a person may come to the point where it's like wearing like old clothes that they don't fit you anymore. Like you feel like you want to change your shirt, or you want a different T-shirt because that one is too tight. So you want one, okay, and I just want one which is, I don't know, I'll just go on with this metaphor because it might have a point, but one more colorful or with more things, and then you want to pick more tools because maybe you have a problem now that you didn't have in the beginning. So that's fine. You approach it when the time comes. And I think the real thing that the community is doing it, it's important that we keep doing that, is recognizing when people are ready to get there, to jump in there, in that knowledge, at the point like reaching for all of the concurrent libraries and constructs when they're ready. Because if it's too early, it's just going to be too much. It's just going to be too much stuff straight away, particularly if it's the first language you pick up, or first functional language you pick up. Then there's already enough into it that you don't want to throw, I think, concurrency right there at the beginning. I think there's different people in the community, in the Bing community, have different opinion. I think you can meet people that encourage you to like start directly with Process from day one, because that's where the power of the VM is. That's true, and in a way that's when you really your code and your infrastructure can really make a big jump. But it doesn't mean that you need that up front. You might not need that for some time before you actually need that. You can build a lot of things that are completely fine without it.
I mean, really, I look at it as, is the domain model that you're modeling right now, is the domain problem you're modeling inherently concurrent? Like, because then you need processes. But before that, if you're just building a web app, like Phoenix needed concurrency, and so it used OTP. But you don't if you're just building some CRUD app. Because
in a way, in some cases, like the more you don't need it, the better it is. Because like concurrent code, I mean, OTP is great, but concurrent code is not. It's tricky independently from the tool. Like you may have good tools to model the problem, but concurrent problems require more testing, more thinking, more more design in a way. So if you don't need it, it's much better if you don't use it, because then you can live without it, and maybe it's perfectly fine. And then you can build your like if you're product focused when a company is product focused and you really have to make ends meet, then that part is important. Like otherwise you just end up diving into it and spending like weeks and months trying to solve a problem that might not even be there.
Yeah, but then at what point? So I can see, you say Mark's example, you're building a CRUD app, you get your app going. At what point do you start recognizing, because it seems like concurrency is a tool that it's not always obvious where it's going to pay off. I mean, some areas like outsourcing jobs from your main process and things like that, so sending emails and kind of the typical things that we reach for a queuing system or something like that. It's like, okay, go spawn a process and do the thing. but sometimes it's not always obvious where the payoff is. So are there certain triggers or trip points that you're going to run into in your REST app where you're going to go, I really could use the concurrency model here?
It gets to a point where you can, if you start to think about events, like if you get to the point where you have different things that would happen at the same time in your domain, not without necessarily forcing it, but or consequences of certain domain actions that ripple through different points, and then you start to think about, maybe I should have an event system here, or maybe I should try to decouple things so that all the failure cases around all of these things are separate. Like for example, if I place an order to buy certain things, I want to make sure that that specific order goes through, but a series of other operations connected to it, they don't need to happen at the same time, and more than that, they should happen independently without affecting the fact that I placed the order. So when you start to think about things like maybe doing something, and then if it doesn't work, I want to retry, and some of these semantics, they fit into a background processing kind of infrastructure, but in other cases they don't. And I think the main sort of like actor that comes into place for this is when you start to think about what needs to work, no matter how your infrastructure is affected by problems. So if you start to think about, okay, I have my golden path in my application that should work. Maybe my email provider is down, but my golden path should work. And then maybe my database starts to have problems, but maybe I can still perform some of the functionality, the most important one, if I leverage, for example, keeping some data in memory until my database comes back up. Because if it's really important, then you do get to a point where you start to think about these things. I think in other languages and in other frameworks, there's a sort of a very strong dependency of certain elements in your infrastructure. I think the good thing that Elixir can give you is it gives you a lot of tools that you can use to write code that is more available, meaning it can survive more problems and isolating all of these failures. And when you start looking into this, then it's all the landscape changes completely, because you need tools that let you build a problem with discrete components that survive no matter how the other ones are performing. And what if you have another server and not just one? Because, no one has, or rather, very few people have physical servers now that they maintain, but metaphorically speaking, anyone can pull the plug from your AWS instance. So what if that goes down? Where does my data go? Yeah, maybe it's all in the database, but maybe not. Because the more you put these concerns into play, the more you end up having different layers of complexity, and you cannot just stack everything vertically, sequentially into a series of things. At one point, they will make you, they will push in a way to be laid out as a series of concurrent components. It's like if you, like sometimes, I don't know, I tell people that if they go up a mountain and they look at a town down below, they see the buildings, like they recognize a post office, they recognize a bank, they recognize other buildings, and all these things function independently. And from that height, you can't really understand what's happening inside each one of them. You just know that if that's a post office, probably it's going to do these things, and the bank people are going to withdraw money and pay money. But you have at the same time, you have the vision of a town working, but then you also know that these components work independently from one another. So I think at the moment your system grows to a certain level of complexity and you start to see those different buildings in it, and they emerge because the domain sort of like helps you identifying them, that's where most of the times concurrency comes into play. It's true that in many types of applications, it's just much quicker, or from day one, you sort of like identify those components. But in other cases, it takes time for them to emerge, for the architecture to show that it does need to be refactored into concurrent processes.
One other area that comes to mind, sorry, I don't mean to hog the mic, guys, is testing. So I may have an app that is that basic REST app, as was brought up before, but I may want to run my test concurrently because it's not set up in a way that would really largely take much advantage of concurrency, but running my tests concurrently would make them run faster if I have multiple cores in my machine. So is that a good gateway drug to this, or are you better off understanding how it affects your app first?
So if you want to do like fast async testing, the less, I would say, very, very, very like bare bone rule, but the less processes you have to coordinate, the easier it is to do. Like if you have like concurrent testing and then each test is basically run as a concurrent function, the less they touch other processes, the easier it is to coordinate because they don't interfere with each other. The problems come in when you have things like, for example, the classic one that I see in a lot of applications is that you have an agent, for example, which is a process that stores some in-memory data, and that agent has a name, so that you can reference it throughout your entire code base. And then when you write tests, you have two completely separate tests that potentially affect each other because they, at any given time, they can write or read data to this agent, and they make assumptions about that data that get violated by the other test. And at that point, the only thing you can do if you don't refactor your code completely is, okay, these two tests, they cannot run concurrently. They cannot run in parallel. So I have to do one, then restore my data and or reset my data, and then do the other, which I think I used to do Ruby. This was a problem that you would have when coordinating tests against the database. Like if you were doing an integration test and feature test against the database, you would have to synchronize at any given point in time because you wouldn't know what's already inside your database. It's exactly the same problem, just in a much, much more focused scope. So the sort of like the line that you walk at that point is, I want to have my code which is simple. Like if you have an agent with a name and you look at that code once you write it, it's really simple to read, but it actually packs way more complexity than you think when you look at testing. Testing, you're definitely right. It's actually one of the best ways to isolate coupling that you have between different parts of your system that ends up depending on what in the end is basically share state. Like it's always the same problem. That process is a form of state and two things depend on it, and suddenly you have to find yourself coordinating them, which is what you basically want to run away from by choosing the languages. I don't want to worry about share state that affects how I write my code, even my test code. It's true that it's not your production code, but still it is something that you touch on a daily basis, so it should be easier than that. And there's so much you can do without sort of like stepping back and re-architecting that code so that it starts to remove all of those dependencies. And that's very interesting. That's a bit challenging, but it's one of the interesting bits about structuring your code base.
So Claudio, you mentioned earlier also that you come in and help these projects when they're already mature. That's when they've grown to a point where they're like, okay, we're experiencing some growth issues, maybe some problems that we're not sure how to handle. We could really benefit from a consultant or some more experience. So I'm just curious, in your experience, you don't name any names, of course, but like I'm assuming that most of the organizations you're helping are using Phoenix as a front end to their Elixir applications. Is that right?
Majority, yes. Although there's a good amount. To my surprise, I would say there's a good amount of customers that they do sometimes like data processing projects. But in general, if there's any form of web, it's definitely Phoenix. Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's I'm just thinking about like all the different use cases. There's definitely a lot of Phoenix around just HTTP APIs. Is basically the most common part. A little bit less, I think, or at least in my experience, the real-time layer is there. Channels and everything are there, but it's much less. I think it's in a way it's a less common need that people have. Although it is by far the one that creates more sort of like more work, more infrastructure. Is in a way HTTPs are a very well, I think, understood problem, if in the sense that companies tend to have experience in them, like no matter what the language is. Not all just Ruby companies that introduce Elixir. There's plenty of other languages in the mix. But all when it comes to testing and integration and load balancers and sessions and cookies and all of that, it's quite the knowledge you basically transport all of that. But when it comes to real time, it's way different, especially if you put into play anything that is not browser based, like native applications and things like that. It's where I think, in a way, it's where you have the opportunity to, I think, to contribute a lot in terms of like finish off as a good skeleton, I think. But I don't think that skeleton is enough. If your real time application is complex, you will have to sort of like take that skeleton and extend it so that it covers your use case better, because the shape of real-time program is just much more complex. There's way more things to take into account, and like the network is bad and it falls apart. And mobile devices that the network layer just does whatever it wants to do. I don't know. I'm on a project where at one point we would get devices where the application was closed, and then 30 minutes later you would just see the application coming back online, and no one was touching the phone, and no one knows how that happened. But it was just like reconnecting in the background. And so things that require like a certain amount of creativity in debugging and I mean, I don't have much hair myself, but I did have a little bit more before starting on these things.
I was wondering if there are any, I think it's helpful for me to learn sometimes from other people's mistakes. I'd prefer not to make them myself, even though I continually do. But like from some of these mistakes that you've seen, you've come in possibly to a project, and like, what is some of the worst, I don't know, abuses or architectures or patterns that you've seen where people have really kind of gotten themselves into a pain point, and if that's something that we can learn from?
Honestly, I haven't seen anything that I was thinking like, oh my God, that's terrible. That only applies to when I look at my own things. Like after 6 months to a year, then I definitely feel like maybe I should rewrite this. But in terms of what I've seen done by other people, I think, and I think this is a testament to the sort of like to the language and the platform. You don't, or I haven't seen anything that is really bad, or I would say bad in a way that is, it wouldn't be bad in any other language. Like you see examples of maybe like code that is incredibly coupled or convoluted logic or things that you just want to run away from, but it could be written in any other language and it will still be equally difficult to look at. I think the most common things that it's I see everywhere. There's it's when so like people get really excited about certain features of the language and they go a little bit overboard with them. And I think the classic one is always macros. Like macros is the one that time sync, I would say, in terms of debugging, and because it's very it can be very pervasive. There's I've seen like in some cases code bases where the entire part of the business logic was revolving around the usage of some macros that would look really clever. I mean, they're clever because once you get them to work, you do feel clever. But the price of refactoring them out when it comes to that complexity was a lot. Like, well, it in some cases it would take like maybe a couple of weeks to remove everything and to replace it with functions. And to circle back to what we were sort of like talking about before, the main reason would be that you get to a point where it gets really difficult to test. The other thing is, and that's quite a I think it's a topic you might have talked about it a bit already, maybe in a previous episode. So I'm sorry because I'm digging just out of my memory, but configuration is another topic. I think that it's currently a hot topic in the community, but it's especially if you overlay that with deployment strategies, it's where like you sort of like you draw it on a board like a sort of like a Cartesian product of configuration options, strategies, and deployment options, and then you just like throw a dart into it and then pick one combination, because it's so complicated to tame, where you have environment variables and compile time values and runtime values, and then no one understands what's happening anymore. And it works on my machine, but not on staging, but it works in production. And in the end, you just don't know which database you're connecting to. Like it can definitely evolve into that. So I think in general, it's I would say like abusing some constructs. I haven't I've been read accounts by other people around like abusing like gen servers and OTP constructs, but I haven't come across much of that myself. I think maybe a little bit too many agents I've seen in the wild. I think using them a bit less would be beneficial, but I don't want to make it too much of a blanket statement about that, because it really is a matter of just looking at the application and see, what are you putting in that agent? This is something that everyone has to access in your code. So why are you putting it inside a single process? Maybe there's a better way to do that. The other thing which I encourage people honestly not to be scared about is reading some Erlang when needed. Because in the end, I think it's the commas at the end of the line that scare people off. And
I can confirm that was what put me off of it back when it was first open sourced. I was like, nope, syntax is weird.
Deploy more, pay less with DigitalOcean, the simplest all-in-one cloud computing platform for developers. Scale and run cloud applications faster and more efficiently with effortless administration tools to robust compute, flexible configurations, networking services, real-time alerts, and rapid provisioning, while enjoying industry-leading price to performance with a flat pricing structure across all global data center regions at any usage volume. Spend more time building better web apps and less time worrying about managing infrastructure with DigitalOcean. Build your next app on DigitalOcean. Get started with a free $100 credit at do.co/elixir.
It's so in a way, I prefer. I'll say it. I prefer Erlang syntax over Elixir syntax from the point of view of how consistent it is. The syntax is extremely consistent from my point of view, but the language is less powerful in areas that are more suitable for the type of projects and things that I'm doing, like string manipulation or date times or macros versus like intelligent use of macros, or rather hoping to make an intelligent use of macros compared to how trickier that is in Erlang. I think the ergonomics of Elixir as language are I enjoy them more. I think it is a step forward in terms of how more easily you can combine things together when you write a program. But I do think that if you can get past some of the quirkiness of Erlang, it's quite a good thing to look at, because you have less tools available. So it forces you to simplify what you want to write. It's much more difficult to, in a way, to shoot yourself in the foot with for example, with incredibly clever macros, because you're not going to do that in Erlang. Like it's not as easy to sneak in a macro. Or you have the language is when it comes, for example, to embracing immutability. For example, like once you assign a variable or you bind a variable, you cannot rebind it with the same name, which is something that Elixir allows rebinding. That's something that it helps understanding the concept of immutability much better, because this thing, you give it a name and that's it. That's the name. You cannot do it again. It becomes clunky in production code, because you see things like people calling this connection
request 1, request 2, request 3.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But if it solidifies the knowledge that once you, for example, if you read, if you perform a side effect and you read something, then you're gonna get back potentially a different version of the same thing, and you're gonna have to give it a different name, and it makes that code not particularly pleasant to read. Like request 1, 2, 3, 4 is not great, but it's really explicit what's happening. Where in some cases, because of rebinding in Elixir, like the pipe operator removes a lot of this in terms of being a problem. But in some cases, you see, if you're not careful, you may scratch your head for a few minutes before realizing that, you have a variable that has the same name of a function, and because of that, you're shadowing the function you want to use, or you're rebinding the same variable, but you forgot about that. So there's certainly, the compiler helps in some cases, but I found that, at least in my personal sort of like learning journey, some of the ideas of the platform, they sort of like, they made sense in my head once I saw them in Erlang. I started with Elixir and then went a bit back to Erlang and then back to Elixir. And I think the comparison, making a comparison between the two languages distilled some ideas right to the core, independently from the API that you use to manipulate them, which I think it's useful, like, especially if Elixir is the first functional language that you approach. I think doing a bit of Erlang serves as a reinforcement, because at the end of the day, sooner or later you might need to at least read it, and possibly write a bit. And I think it's worth doing it. Again, same as OTP, you might not need it 3 months in, 6 months in, but later on it might be useful, especially because a lot of really good tooling has been built in Erlang, and there's not necessarily an equivalent in Elixir yet, or maybe there's not going to be one because it wouldn't be sustainable to replicate that tool in Elixir if it's already available in Erlang. So you just want to, I think if you pick one, you can definitely pick the other, where the biggest learning is the first language, and the other one is much less daunting.
Is there a resource or anything that you would recommend for people who wanted to kind of start dipping in a little bit to Erlang?
I think Joe Armstrong's books are, I think they're thorough. The only thing is that in some cases the examples may be a bit far from what, like, if you come in terms of like web programming, you might not have come across use cases that show up in the more classic Erlang books, because it might not be the domain you're familiar with. So in that sense, you might find yourself in having to understand both the language and the problem, which is it might be a bit too much. I think, in that way, I found one thing that some people told me that it works for them is if you've done Elixir and you've read Elixir in Action, Sasha Juric's book, then my Francesco Cesarini's book, like Designing for Scalability with Erlang and OTP. By the way, thank you, Francesco, for such a long title, because it's very easy to remember. But that's a good. I think there's definitely a few parallels between the two books, meaning you can see the same idea expressed in both languages, and also the Designing for Scalability has a way more content beyond that, which I think is it's very useful in terms of distributed systems and all of that. It's the type of book that you pick and you read chunks of it at different points in your learning journey. Like it's not something you read all in one shot. But that gives you the ability to map the same ideas and see it in both languages. I think the main thing is that once you've done like enough Elixir, I think you want to refresh basically about the syntax and maybe a little bit around the tooling, which is similar, but it's not the same. It tends to overlap for a lot of ideas because there's been a lot of cross-pollination between the two communities in the last few years, especially in terms of tooling. So thankfully, Package Manager is the same, although that there's Mix and Rebar, and you may have to learn a bit more about configuration and how to build your application. But for especially to recode, I think it's you can definitely have easy enough mapping between the two things.
So I wanted to ask you, since you've looked at quite a lot of Elixir projects, what would you say the percentage of people actively using Dialyzer on their projects is?
Not many. Meaning, I've seen people increasingly using more type specification. So I'm not sure how much people who are listening are familiar with Dialyzer. So I'll just like give like a 30-second introduction to the tool. So Dialyzer is an optimistic type checker. It's not part of your compile process, but it ships with most of it, or rather Dialyzer ships with your installation of Erlang. You might have to add maybe like one package to use it from Elixir, but it is there as a tool. And what it does is it does a form of static analysis on your compile code, and it's an optimistic type checker. So it doesn't lie, but so it cannot be 100% accurate because it's not. That's not what a tool is for. But when it says that something doesn't add up, meaning it says like these two things don't work with each other, it's 100% sure that that's the case. So you can use it to sort of like annotate your code, which has the other benefit of if you annotate it using specifications and types, you get really nice docs out of it. But also you can do a static check of how things are wired together in your application. The trouble is that it's as a tool, if you do a cold run, it's quite slow. And even if you run it regularly, it takes long enough for it to run on a code base to be a bit painful. And the other thing, this is all things that are being addressed in terms of how this can change into the future. The other thing is, it's that the errors sometimes are not incredibly friendly or easy to parse, like for just the human eye. Like you see like a wall of red with really big data structures that just says like this map with 35 keys doesn't match this other map, which looks incredibly similar, but I can't really tell you the difference between the two. You kind of have to hunt it. And like if you're like me, I just like bump up my font size and then spend like a good 10-15 minutes just by comparing one key one after the other. So after the first or second time that you do that, it gets a little bit repetitive. So it's useful if you can sort of like tame the complexity. But I've seen a lot of, like willpower by people, like just like very optimistic, like they start using it. Over time, a lot of people give up. So in that respect, I think my suggestion in that respect is maybe try to use it. It's you probably want to make it part of CI if you have CI running. I'm not sure if you can run it locally. I believe VS Code has good integration with it in the form of a persistence server that might speed things up, but I'm not a VS Code user, so I'm not 100% sure of that. I know that on smaller code bases, I use it frequently. On big application code, which ironically is where you would want it the most, it tends to slip through the cracks and become like it just tends to be like sometimes forgotten, which is a shame because it does save you in some cases.
All right, so I'm not the only one.
No. It's a shame because by the way, it's if you use it with you're using it with Elixir, it gets tricky simply because the error messages in many cases they are Erlang error messages. So that goes back to what I was saying before. If you get familiar with Erlang, then you sort of like make a quick translation of what you're seeing in terms of Erlang terms, and then you map them to Elixir terms, and they become understandable. But that's what discourages a lot of people when they see like errors related to protocols or error related to like things like supertypes and things that don't like you don't come across those terms and those ideas unless you are using Dialyzer itself. They don't just surface in the language. You never hear of supertypes when you talk about Elixir unless you are actually using the Dialyzer and running it. So that's the part where it gets discouraged. Like in a way, I know I'm just gonna throw you like a I think like as I say on a silver platter, Josh, but the Elm compiler is sort of goes into that direction with a much more, I think, like beginner friendly attitude. I think Elixir and Dialyzer have the potential to get there. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, I'd love to see a Google Summer of Code or something, or just someone that's extremely generous with their time. Figure out how to make Dialyzer as pleasant to use as your sort of design tool help as the Elm compiler is, because that's my favorite thing about Elm. And I've not been able to find a way to get anything like that workflow with Dialyzer, though I've tried.
So there's definitely going to be like, or at least I'm a bit fuzzy on the details, but there's definitely effort in terms of, there's been a recent merges into OTP that like in the Erlang source and the OTP source to provide more metadata around compiled bin files that could be used to have richer type analysis that you could leverage through a compiler. Whether that's going to lead to a proper type checker or anything like that, I'm not entirely sure, because it's all in progress. But certainly, there's already Elixir already has, for example, like if you've seen like some error messages that you have in development when you have specific exceptions or like missing pattern matches, it's already able to tell you a lot about your code in an error scenario that could also be leveraged in some ways at compile time. So I hopefully that's going to happen in the foreseeable future. But at this point in time, I think it's worth looking into it. If you write an open source project or if you write a library, I think it's worth spending time into it. Like a big application is a different matter, but if you provide an open source package, I think providing types and specifications, it's incredibly important, because it helps people navigating the docs. And if
I would say if you do provide specs in your library, please do run Dialyzer, because sometimes I've had problems where a library explicitly lied about the spec, and I couldn't use things because Dialyzer saw the spec and said, no, this is not valid, but it wasn't. The spec was wrong.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, in that case, yeah, definitely run it. It's a problem beyond a certain code size. So, I mean, unless you're very ambitious with the scope of your library and you're writing something really huge, it's I think is manageable for a lot of projects, open source projects, to sort of like make it part of the tool chain and possibly of their CI.
So, do you have any stories or examples of systems that you've worked on that you've been able to, help them out with these particular solutions?
So I've spent pretty much, I'm going for like almost 2 years on a long running assignment plus other small ones. So digging in my memory, it's very easy to think about what I'm doing now. So I've been working on the backend system for a real time application this application has multiple versions on mobile devices, and it's sort of like a shared activity with a chat part and shared documents. There's a little bit of everything, with a lot of integrations around emailing and SMSs and other sort of like external providers and things like that. It's quite it was one of those systems where you feel like you're extending like an octopus and touching all sorts of other parts in a very large infrastructure. And it's interesting because in a way it's been like over time, like back and forth in sort of like try to keep the complexity under control. And I think one thing that I would say is that, and I don't know, like I'm trying to understand if there's anything that can be open sourced out of this, just speaking with the rest of the team about it. But one thing that is definitely worth, I think, looking into, or one thing that worked out really fine, is generating documentation from your code, which is something that it's in a way, I think it's not much explored into Elixir. I think other languages have more of that because for example, in some cases the language has specific properties that make it easier to do that. But for example, if you ask yourself the question, like you write an HTTP endpoint and there's Swagger, there's all of sorts of other tools. But what about like if you use Phoenix and use channels? What about documenting all of those things? It's just blobs of JSON that go back and forth, and how do you document that? How do you make sure that your documentation works, and how do you make sure that you're not lying about it and it's actually what it is, and hopefully it sits in the code and is checked and everything. So one thing that worked out fine, which I I don't know, I encourage people looking into it a bit, is if you have to stick with JSON as your sort of like encoding, maybe think about like one idea we had that worked out fine was using JSON schema, for example, as a way to check payloads in and out of a channel, and also because of that generate documentation out of it. So that's like one of the things that I think macros are good for, sort of like looking at your code and understanding how your code is structured to generate some data about it. So in this case, it would mean like looking at all of the actions that you have in your channels, and then for each one of them, running some automated checks at compile time that guarantee that the docs you wrote about it are true. If you apply a schema to some data, then your documentation should also respect the schema, for example. And these are things that you know, like especially when it comes to, I think a lot of the tutorials you read and documentation you read about Phoenix and books as well, you don't see much of that explored, because it's very rare that you can see a code base of a certain size where this becomes really a problem, because maybe you don't have enough actions, enough different public APIs in your channels, or you don't have versioning into play already, or you don't have to support legacy clients, because the problem with mobile applications is that no one updates their phones reliably. So you got the same version running for 6 months, and then you have like the same operation that has like 3-4 different versions that have to run at any given time to support everyone. And people get confused by it because you have to document each one of them. And when someone has a problem and they have a version that is too old, you don't know where to look. So all of these things, I think, is where if for people who are interested into contributing to the community, I think there's certainly a lot of things that you could be researched around this. And the other thing was, I've seen some systems where people get to, and I'm guilty on that in some ways, you get enthusiastic about the language, and then you think like, I'm just going to implement this thing by myself and make it custom for this, because it would be neat to build it with OTP, or it would be neat to build it in this way because it really fits like a glove for this use case. But then this thing starts to grow up a bit, and then you get to the point where it's just too complex, and you just don't want to get rid of it. So because it's the thing that you built yourself. So in some cases, I think it might be worth like spending a little bit more time thinking about the problem and just accepting the fact that maybe you want to use a queuing system, and it's okay to use a queue system if you already have a roadmap in front of you where you know that you're going to have maybe like 2-3 servers for resilience, and then you don't want to lose messages or things that happen in your system. And if you put those things on the table, yeah, you could build everything like that yourself, but chances are that it might be not as best as it could be compared to something that has been, like battle tested by way more developers with way more production hours. So that's the thing. And the last thing, I don't know if I sort of like, I don't know if I sort of like steered away from the original question, but in a way, one thing that I think the community is sort of like getting into is reasoning about things at a different level. Like when you, in a way, there's Dave Thomas gave recently a talk, like a very, I found it very provocative and not necessarily like I was sort of like separate the contents of the talk from the delivery in some ways, but in one way the big question is that like are we sort of like prisoner about the way things have been done so far, and should we look into maybe like start from scratch with some ideas and think about problems differently? And it's sort of like a middle ground between following what has been done before and trying to sort of like start from scratch. Is maybe we need more abstractions that talk about more like the semantics rather than the implementation. Like a lot of the conversation around when you talk about Elixir is, I'm going to use a gen server or I'm going to use a supervisor, and I'm going to use these things. But that's an implementation detail. In some ways, it will be, for some people, that's not concrete enough. If you start to talk about components that, for example, I want to have a thing or a component that is the only component in my entire system that does a specific operation, or I want to have different workers that are completely independent from each other, and they pick up a job and they do it. And when you start to talk about these semantics, then you can reason about those, and then the rest becomes an implementation detail, and then you start to understand why the language includes so many building blocks, because those building blocks are necessary to build these things. But in some cases, we start by saying you need them without giving more context about why they're there in the first place.
Interesting. Can we get a link to that talk by Dave Thomas?
Yeah, sure. I'll post it in the show notes, I guess.
All right. Are there any other areas that we should explore?
I don't know if everyone's happy. I think from my point of view, I think we cover pretty much an extensive ground. So I don't know if there's more to throw on the table.
Okay. Well, then, if people want to find you online, where you blog, where you tweet, where you post your code, where is all that stuff?
So I've got the same username everywhere now. So I'm Cloud, spelled CLOUD, 8421, pretty much everywhere. GitHub, Twitter, and things like that. I apologize for that username, but it's from the time when Yahoo was a thing, and you try to get a username and they suggest variations, and then I picked this one, and it's just too late to change it. So it will be in the show notes, but I'm basically the same username everywhere. Feel free to ping for anything.
All right, perfect. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks then. Josh, do you want to start us off with picks?
I sure do. So Elm Europe just wrapped up, and right now there are 2 live streams, recordings of the live stream that are up. Lots of really good talks in there. I haven't finished all of them, but I definitely recommend Evan Czaplicki's talk, where a big part of the talk is discussing how the browser API for getting things like viewport height and whatnot is really complicated, and he goes through sort of some design thinking about what do we actually want to do here that makes for a much, much simpler API for the things you actually care about doing. And it's kind of like a meta talk about what Elm design is in the first place. And then Brian Hicks has a separate talk where he talks about gathering sort of problem experiences when you're trying to solve a problem. And they're a good combination to watch together. So anyway, lots of other really cool talks there. There's also one about LitViz, which is sort of like a IPython notebook type thing for Elm and visualizations, and it's really cool. Anyway, so lots of good stuff there. It's a very dense pick, so I'll leave it at that.
Nice. Evan's always an interesting person to talk to. So I'm also curious, just between I guess Josh and Mark and our listeners, would people be interested in an Elm episode?
I'm always interested in talking about Elm. I think that comes across.
I think Elm is super interesting. I've just done exploratory looking into it. I think Josh is the one with the most experience here, at least.
Yeah. I asked because we've had Evan, and I'm going to feel bad because I don't remember his name, but we've had a couple of people on talking about Elm. So
was it Richard?
Yeah,
that's what I thought. Yeah. So Elm and Elixir both had pretty substantial impact on the way I built software, and that's the reason I like both of them so much. So
awesome. We'll see if we can line them up. I know that a lot of the functional programming principles and some of the philosophies behind the languages are pretty similar. So we'll definitely.
Yeah, what we could do is we could. There's a thing called Alchemy, which is an Elm to Elixir sort of transpiler of sorts for building things like gen servers with the Elm pattern. So that would be very interesting to me, at least.
Well, maybe we can line up the Elm episode one week and then the Alchemy one the next week. Anyway, Mark, do you have some picks for us?
Sure do. I've been working with a GraphQL for about 2 years, and Elixir's implementation that provides that service on the back end is the Absinthe library. And so I've come to a different company recently, and I'm introducing GraphQL, and I just love sharing it with people, and I love when they start to kind of get it. And, so like right now we're looking at using it for inter-service communication. So you can have much more specific requests about the data that you want. And then even having a REST interface that we are providing like as an API to a client, like our customers are using this API. So we have versioned APIs, but then having that actually create GraphQL queries so that we have one implementation of how the data is fetched, and then we can version it internally easier. And so I'm just having a blast with that, and I'm just going to share Absinthe and GraphQL as fun things to play with.
And I wanted to pile on, just since you're talking about it, I'm working on something with it right now using Absinthe Phoenix. And if you haven't looked at it, that lets you, among other things, basically describe your controllers as a GraphQL query. So your controller actions are basically a module attribute that describes the GraphQL query to perform. And it's really, really good. Anyway, so if you want to do a static site, but you're also building out your GraphQL API, which is the situation we're in, it's pretty much perfect.
Awesome.
Very cool. I'm going to jump in with a few picks. So this weekend I was working on my yard. We've lived here for like 8 years, and the weed situation in our yard has just been terrible. And so I finally just gave up. We sprayed Roundup on the whole yard, killed all the grass, killed all the weeds, and I tilled it under. And one thing that I've really gotten to like using lately is the Home Depot tool rental. So I don't own a tiller. I don't know that I will ever need to own a tiller, but they had this gigantic hydraulic tiller that I used on my yard, and that worked out pretty nicely. So I'm going to pick that. Also, a few other things that I'm just going to put out there just because I like connecting with people. So I'm going to be going to Podcast Movement, which is the big podcasting conference. It's going to be in Philadelphia this year. And so if you're going to be there, it's funny, I've met podcast listeners at podcaster events. So if you're a podcaster and you're going to be there, I look forward to talking to you. Yeah, or if you're from Philadelphia, just let me know. Just email me, chuck@devchat.tv. Also, if you're a podcaster, I have some software that I've been building to manage my podcast processes. And I'm getting ready to actually want some users on the system just to see how that all works out. So if you're interested in that, you can also email me. And then finally, I'm going to be at the Framework Summit. I know a bunch of people who use Elixir do web development. And so if you're interested in front-end frameworks, Framework Summit is a conference about front-end frameworks. And they're going to have core teams or core team members from pretty much all of the front-end frameworks that you've heard of that are still sort of actively and widely used. So that includes React, Vue, and Angular. And then I'm actually going to be speaking for 15 minutes on Stimulus, which is something that came out of Basecamp at DHH, if you're familiar with the Ruby community. And yeah, so it should be really great. It's close to here. It's in Park City, Utah. So up in the mountains. Terrific place to be. It's going to be in the fall, so it's just going to be gorgeous. So if you want to come out to that, I'm happy to connect with people there as well. Claudio, what are your picks?
So I'm not sure if hopefully this episode is going to be out before then, but in roughly a month from now, 16th of August, we're going to run the Code Elixir London, which is a conference. Last year it had a different name, but tickets are out. So if you are in close proximity to London or you really like to travel, it's a 1 day, 1 track, and I would really love for more people to attend. Last year it was people were happy about it. There's a strong it's community oriented, so the whole way track is particularly entertaining because there's quite a lot of movement, very informal. So I encourage everyone if you can to attend, and it's compared to other conferences, we're trying to make it accessible even from the point of view of the ticket price. So definitely beginner friendly and all of it. So hopefully I can see more people because of this. And the second thing is it's completely unrelated, but I've been following a YouTube channel there's this person in Turkey. My wife is Turkish, so she introduced me to like a few different channels that she follows. And there's this person, he's called Typhoon, and he takes care of a lot of animals. He has a YouTube channel where he publishes, basically, it's a sort of a diary about what he's doing in terms of taking care of stray dogs or squirrels or cats, or pretty much, I think anything that moves. But it's quite, I mean, it's the way it's just like, it warms your heart when you look at how he treats animals. But more than that, it's this YouTube channel is also the way he funds a lot of the things he does in terms of like buying food and preparing shelters and all of that. So it's I don't know, I'm just trying to sort of like throw the link out there because it's one of those things where a subscription or like, you know, subscribing actually does make a difference. And it sort of like, the squirrels are really cute. What can I say? It's really something that it's nice to look at as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming and talking to us about all this stuff.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was definitely a pleasure.
Yeah, well, hopefully there are some folks that listen to this and get some inspiration about how to work around some of the things that they're seeing.
Definitely. I think it's a really good time it's always a good time to join the community, but I think it's a really good time now because there's definitely something for everyone at every level of complexity. And I think it's a very welcoming community. It's quite it's friendly. The core team is friendly. All of the biggest projects really take care of getting people included. So I would encourage anyone to try and approach and just ask if they get stuck, and then if people are always happy to unblock, and whether it's on the IRC channel or Slack or whatever other channel. But yeah, no, definitely.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again for coming, and we will talk to everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.